Hello everyone, today we talk about the history of Rome between the two Gothic sieges, so between 538 and 544 AD, for our series about, in fact, the history of the Eternal City that I started last year. These years are not rich in political and military events for the city of Rome as for political implications. Instead, given that the capital of the Roman Empire, as Rome still was, and nobody would have ever dreamt to even remotely think otherwise, and this is something that we often misunderstand when reading these pages, had to be maintained under the Byzantine control. And yes, I use Byzantine exactly to piss you off, right? At least if you have still that idea that there was there was just a mere legalistic legitimism about Constantinople reconquering these territories, and this is exactly the point. Byzantine control on the city of Rome naturally had to be maintained in the midst of a pretty severe war. Today we will skip the events per se, but you know that essentially the first conquest of southern and central Italy up to the very north had been fairly easy, right? The Goths had tried to oppose themselves. In fact, in the first siege of Vitiges to the same Rome, there had been already ferocious events, but it seemed that imperial forces by this point had basically crushed the Ostrogothic kingdom. If it hadn't been for the fact that, for pretty shady reasons that we do not fully understand from historiography, but that can be, of course, guessed and are somehow famous, Belisarius had been removed from commander-in-chief in this reconquested West, right after the conquest of Vandalic Africa, the invasion of Sicily and the conquest properly of the Ostrogothic hinterland, as he was suspected to be able to carry out some coups in the same empire, coming back to Constantinople in arms and causing some problems. Consider that when the Goths abandoned Rome, a part of, let's say, a delegation of theirs offered Belisarius the crown, right, of Italy, which is quite interesting because it shows, of course, how, still personally rules were understood, and especially by the Germans, indeed. But when you consider what Belisarius was doing, just as an imperial general, but fundamentally at the head of an army of 10 different ethnicities, like the one that quite typically the 6th century Byzantine one is. We made multiple videos about this. We'll have to come back on this specific aspect, though. There was much that could be accomplished, also regarding the same gods, regarding the same possibility of exploiting the Italian resources in that aforementioned attempt to seize power in Constantinople. Now, we will not discuss this aspect specifically because it's worth another video just per se. We made lots of videos about the Justinian era, and you know that I have fundamentally defended the soundness of the political and strategic choice that Justinian made, even though, I honestly don't see very much the conquest in a positive light, given not the outcome per se, but naturally the attitude that the Byzantines had towards the West. That wasn't the restoration of a Roman rule, and again, that's why I keep using the term Byzantine, because the entire political history of these years is that in the West there was hardly any sympathy for the Constantinopolitan government and rule. It's not about Justinian. It's not about even kind of a broader preconception. And in fact, we cannot deny the existence of a late antique civilization. The fact that the same Roman senators had sought to be reintegrated in a way or another in something that looked as a decentralized position, in fact, but somehow stabilized, so with some degree of direct control from the Byzantines, and the way the latter began to deal with these western provinces was definitely the one of foreign occupants, right? So you know that I'm quite sensitive to Latin-Germanic history. Most of my channel is, generally speaking, dedicated to Western Europe, in a sense, and not because I have anything. In fact, I just said it. I think that the Byzantines were actually pursuing a sound choice, which is yet the other thing that people say, no, they overstretched, then the plague arrived, they had to foresee that. How do you foresee that, right? You know, even though these are common things at the time, what the imperial forces managed to achieve in the central and western Mediterranean was amazing, right? Was a great success, right? And you cannot argue that, even in spite of the crisis of the following generations. Fundamentally, the maintenance of positions in Italy, in Africa, and in Spain, by a degree, was fundamentally positive. There is a debate about Africa, for example, regarding especially the cost of the military expenses to defend the hinterland from the Berber incursions. But when you look at Italy, for example, there is no doubt that the Byzantine control of especially the most kind of Greek-influenced southern Italian coastal cities was actually a great advantage. They would remain in imperial control for centuries. There was definitely much that was earned in the process, also in the loot, and in the, as we'll see now, the resources that were squeezed from like Italy in this case, but that was the kind of the richest, the largest of these territories, and that for dramatic, political, moral, religious, properly imperial reasons, had Rome, and the only purpose of anyone who even wishes to dream to be a Roman emperor is, of course, to rule the world from Rome, right? And there is no other option, right? For the entire Middle Ages and beyond, nobody ever thought anything different from this, right? Even if they had never ruled over Rome. And this aspect is central, inasmuch the city naturally had a dramatic prestige, not just in a symbolical, empty way, as it's sometimes said. No, but this time, exactly, at the time of the Gothic War, Rome suffered heavy blows. It was just like an empty vessel of some sort. BS, right? Rome was essentially the largest city in the West for the entire early Middle Ages, and still remained throughout all, you can argue to this day properly the symbol of imperial millenarism and universal Catholicism, in fact, and there is no doubt that its overwhelming amount, not just of ancient, but still, what was kept being built, right, even throughout all this time, in terms of anything cultural you can imagine, right, even just properly as a cultural center, the role of the papacy, the spiritual guidance of the West, the axis that was formed already at this point with essentially the rest of Europe, and the fact that the Ostrogoths themselves, as soon as they crushed Odoacer, went to Rome to render homage to the papacy, even though they were arrogant, right, and so all this, right, exemplifies the magnitudinal scale of the sheer civilizational impact that Rome had by overbearing degree. For, in fact, these powers to even be able to manage to control the city for millennia to come, essentially, you can argue that even beyond the Italian unification, there has been, exactly from those days, a papal state in the world that is the most directly connected polity to anything corresponding to imperial Rome in the original universal sense, and this spiritual aspect is not sometimes even properly perceived in a world where there is still, I don't know, a pope that twits, right, And that, of course, many things changed in many ways. But aside from this aspect, we still have, say, a base to reflect on, right? And the entire picture that is drawn here shows also still the autonomy that Rome had in this game politically, right? Because literally at this point, the peninsula has been invaded by imperial forces. Now, Belisarius ruled in Rome, as we'll see now, because, this time between the two Gothic sieges, he stayed in Rome for a while to take care of the city. There are some vestiges from, in fact, Belisarius' time still visible, for example, in the Aurelian walls. If you look, for example, all the trade next to the so in many places, but the Salarian Gate, the Zinarian Gate, etc. There are properly at the top. You can recognize the levels that were added or restored by Belisarius in the 6th century, and there is naturally a continuity that a Roman government, as all cities at the time that were essentially quite municipally minded. And in the Roman case even more, because you understand that this was still seen, I want to stress this, by every single body, everywhere, as the capital of the Roman Empire, right? And there was never such a thing, like sometimes I see videos on YouTube, when did they think that Rome fell? Rome never fell, by definition, right? You can have sacks, you can have conquerors, whatever, but this thing fundamentally remains alone, right? It's not truly conquered and ruled over concretely for good throughout the entire period and beyond, and it remains because there is an imperial presence that, as we just said, the city recognized, because the same empire was recognized in the same way, but that naturally, as we have seen, also imperially speaking, was considering this bond on the basis of how much imperium was actually displayed by these rulers, right? What's the point of this all? Well, the point being that at the end of the first Gothic siege, right, Belisarius, that had already been in through quite some, by the way, siege experiences. There had been a climatic victory just in front of the walls of Rome. It had been not much of a great military, engagement during the first Gothic siege. There had been some assaults attempted by the Goths. We know things in pretty good detail. In fact, I will have to make a video about that, because it's quite interesting to intertwine it, not just with the military side of it, but the fact that you can literally walk in the same places nowadays, and having probably even a dimensional idea of what happened. Of course, had to take care of some kind of restoration. Some were necessary just for the security of the city that had been sensibly, tired by this siege, and that was suffering still of the consequences of it. For example, the aqueduct of the Aqua Traiana, that was the only one not completely destroyed by the Goths, that at some point basically served, for example, the Neronian aqueduct to try to, to render the Byzantine resistance more hardware, right? The Goths had never been able to fully surround the city and had not caused this damage for the sake of destruction or whatever. There is an entire historiography that, of course, wanted to represent this the decadence of antiquity, so the terrible barbarian Goths that destroyed, the aqueducts or made scorched earth strategy. Later on, as we'll see now, also with Baduila/Totila, etc. But the entire picture of this is what we're painting now, is the fact that the Ostrogoths, notoriously enough, and I made multiple videos about this, had created the best, most successful example of Romano-Germanic coexistence, literally with Italy still administered by the Roman institutions and ruled militarily by the Gothic forces, right? This was the thing, right? The consistorium of Ravenna, of Theodoric the Great, was equally split between Goths and Romans. They took deliberations together. Naturally, we haven't made... I made a video about Ostrogothic Italy, especially in the moment of greater splendor. Naturally, problems had occurred, because just like in any other country where essentially the Arians wanted to remain Arians for, again, mostly a reason of internal political power, not because they cared that much about the theological stand there. And the political thing being, in fact, that there was a Roman senatorial elite that they needed to make the country work, but that still looked at Constantinople for hopefully being reintegrated, getting rid of the Goths, and or at least, reducing them to some kind of greater of subjection rather than of rule, right? Had somehow held as a system up to that point, in spite of all, and the structure of the country was still intact, right? It's the Gothic Wars, and especially, yes, the Gothic comeback under Baduila that, however, was essentially carrying out a struggle for expelling the Byzantines at that point, because also the Romano-Italic senators, I made a video about them, that were quite different from the Byzantine aristocracy, and actually a much more properly noble one, had somehow paid for the fact of having invited the Byzantines, or however to have rendered possible the invasion in the first place, because the Byzantines didn't care at all about Italy, about the Romano-Italic senators. Many of these actually fled to Constantinople at some point during, in fact, the Gothic comeback, but the latter consisted in essentially liberation of, first of all, the colonists that inhabited the large latifundia that had been destroyed by the war, and this entire idea of redemptional imperial struggle, for which, if I elevate you to the rank, properly to the status of God himself as a freeman, right, and you will fight for me, you have the chance there to redeem the entire system, to be able to represent a just world, right? And this mechanism fundamentally is the same reason why the Longobards later managed to gain the decisive moral support of the Italian population against the Byzantines, because the locals realized that a foreign domination was just as dramatically oppressive, especially from a fiscal point of view, than what they could simply have now that the entire latifundia system had collapsed, and so kind of small medium property was the same one, that the Longobards, these other Germanic peoples, this would be the last one settling in Italy, were living by, and so that there could be as it would happen, essentially a synthesis between the locals and the sharp minority, by the way, of the conquerors, numerically speaking, to, in fact, elevate the entire population to a higher status than it had been before, right? So in the entire historiographical panorama, instead, the idea is somehow either, like from a Romanistic perspective, the fact, oh my god, these terrible gods were a bunch of, barbaric motherfuckers and all this thing that destroyed everything, whatever, they were bloodthirsty, the same goes for the Longobards, etc. Then there is the Germanistic perspective that thinks that instead, no, the Germans arrived, they exterminated all the terrible Romans, who were just a bunch of degenerates who never did anything for human civilization, because it was better to be, to live in a stinky village at the outskirts of nowhere than what remained actually as a dramatic level of development of countries like Italy, even up well after the Roman Empire, throughout all the rest of history. And so, everything changed, everything was razed to the ground, no Romans anymore, this thing never existed, and so this mentalities, as widespread as they are, they just, of course, exemplify how much not just history is not just intuitive, but that in order to understand it intuitively, you should at least know anything about what happened historically, which is something that naturally takes time, and the the entire picture here is the constant struggle against of the Byzantines and the Goths over essentially the only possible legacy existing in the world, the Catholic universal Roman Empire, right? The entire point of any people living at the time, knowing Rome and knowing what it meant, was exclusively being a Roman emperor ruling the world from Rome, and nothing else. Like the entire history of the Middle Ages is exclusively about this, right? Not the kind of modernistic view for which, I don't know, the rise of of other identities locally. It's the fragmentation of universal power, of the point of connection between God and man. It's the greatest disaster in the history of mankind, right? And at this point, people from the 6th century, from Constantinople, the Goths, anybody around, understood it so clearly and limpidly. Their entire life was about that, because they were intelligent people, differently from today's ones, and they were struggling essentially over this, right? Naturally, the picture here is complicated, again, by the fact that there has been indeed a decline, right? The migration era was truly a disastrous moment for everyone involved. There was no winner in the entire picture. There was just a magnitudinal collapse, essentially, of the aforementioned imperial capacity that basically took the world like at least a good half of a millennium to recover from, in order to achieve anything that could be at least compared in absolute force overall, not talking about the capacity of political compaction to re-achieve, right? And nor the Romans nor the Germans were living better, right? If not the Germans, maybe living in the former lands of the empire in the west. But again, the picture was not better overall in this sense for the general standards of everyone involved compared to what had been existing before. And the desperate attempt to control Rome is one of the most important indicators of this struggle, right? So as we were saying before, Belisarius was trying to restore Rome, also as far as naturally the possibility of an eventual coup, the possibility again of properly consolidating a solid political and territorial control of the Italian peninsula that again was feasible at this point, because the first wave of the imperial forces had essentially managed to reconquer Italy without, say, particular structural damage, right? The Goths had been defeated quite easily. After all, Procopius describes these things abundantly. There is a bit of kind of their Hellenic, Byzantinistic kind of technologism, whatever, but it speaks well also of naturally the faults of the Goths that had somehow been politically divided, that were in fact again always this problem that had happened to the Vandals would happen still to the Visigoths, and that would cripple fundamentally the political unit of the country, which is arguably the only reason why the Byzantines could make it, especially in Italy in the first place, right? We again talked about Ostrogothic history, the international relations that Theodoric had managed to forge, the partial fragility of the system, but the deeper implications, right, Europe-wide regarding this order, and what the Goths, from an Arian standpoint, wanted to maintain, also looking at, however, the, say, mostly the still pagan Central European population that sided with Ostrogothic Italy, and also with, paradoxically, with Romanity, right, as far as instead they were opposed to the Byzantine reconquest that could have also just brought them again more gravitationally within still the system, and maybe on the longer run exposed them, and especially the Merovingian threat, right? That instead was actually the winning one, as inasmuch as, differently from the Goths, they had immediately converted from paganism to Catholicism. So they had skipped entirely all these issues that the Goths were also having. They had been sponsored by the Byzantines that, telling the truth, were now reconquering the rest of what they had lost of the Mediterranean. Most likely not even because they considered the Goths as such as a great threat. Now they understood their power was undermined, but rather to stop the Merovingian expansion, right? And this is also likely why eventually the Longobards entered Italy later on, because it doesn't seem to have been at least just an act of force, right? There was surely, even though we don't have, and it's normal not to have that, a direct evidence of that, of an agreement between Constantinople and this Symmachoi, the equivalent of the Federati in Greek, was planned, right? It was planned to create a sort of buffer state in the Po Valley to stop the Franks at the Alps, and then cooperating with imperial forces to keep, in fact, the Merovingians out of the Mediterranean, which is actually, in a Frankish perspective, would happen anyway in Carolingian times, and probably a far-sighted realization from the side of Constantinople. They knew very well what was happening in the West. So this is why this issue is so big, because literally Rome is in between all this. And it doesn't simply take to retake Rome and treat it just like, it's a, how do you imagine you can control Rome in the 6th century? You don't simply just control cities. I mean, ask Justinian and Theodora about the Nika revolt. I made a video about that in the same Constantinople. So Rome is always going to be infiltrated by dramatic international influences that are going to make leverage on the quite unruly and powerful Roman aristocracy, property of the city of Rome, that was always aware of its international role and always exploited it quite ruthlessly to maintain a Roman autonomy. Also through the papacy, through whoever was, in fact, the only institution at this point that was really ruling Rome as such, right? Because otherwise, even the Militia Romanorum that was created after the Justinian reconquest for a time was a Byzantine garrison, but quite soon, from the 7th century already, it was just made up of local Roman troops, right? And so this tells you the degree of autonomization, naturally of evaporation, also of imperial power, especially during the Islamic invasions. And so the most obvious loss in at least direct control over most of these western provinces that had been reconquered during the previous centuries, because they would simply autonomize themselves, and that's how they mostly started going, right? And in this sense, don't think that even the Byzantine Italian possessions were that different, say, from, I don't know, the Lombard ones, or had been different from the Ostrogothic ones. They were basically the same country, and they were in comparable ways, not necessarily just similar ones, because of course there are some divides. I made videos about probably of Byzantine history, about the Lombard conquest and the degree of control that Byzantines retained in which areas, why. Then we made videos about the Longobards, especially on the foundation of the kingdom, that politically and territorially must be really studied with a map at hand, a chronology, and a quite important awareness of the fact that the early Middle Ages weren't just a moment of stasis, or that the fact that even though this system had shrank dramatically, especially after the war, the plague, and etc., it was still incredibly aware of what had not just happened, but what had happened in the past in the first place, and what imperial power was all about, right? there was the sense, first of all, of the power of the church in Rome. We still have to make an adequate amount of videos about this, but just for example, Belisarius, or at least the Romans under Belisarius, built on the Via Lata, the White Road, a Xenodochium located close to Saint Mary of Trevi, right? The Xenodochia were essentially some hospitals, right? Some broader centers that that had existed, say, since the name is naturally Hellenistic, as you understand, but as welfare structures, fundamentally subsidized by likely the church. We don't know it so directly because we lack a lot of information about this time, but likely so, given that they were all, like, at least in terms of assistential system, the church had always played that role in the empire, and the Xenodochia naturally made money as well, because there were donations, it was not just about the pilgrims that already came from everywhere to Rome, hence Xenodochia, so it's the place of, of the foreigners, right now, but also other, say, elements of society, poor people, sick people, right, that didn't have a place where to live, which, again, in a moment like this, there is still of instability, of war, of distress. There are lots of Roman aristocrats that had fled the city during the first siege, already had gone to Sicily, to Bruttium, some to other places, but say these senators had been largely controlling great and subsidizing and maintaining, and as clients, large parts of the Roman population, right, as they consumed their, what it took to simply to use the infrastructures they had privately founded. They were just giving something to their masters, etc. In this moment of crisis, they found themselves without protection, and this naturally also increased the importance of the papacy. And the papacy, as we will see now, was actually not very happy at all that the empire, or at least the Byzantines, had come back to Rome. Right, the Goths and the papacy had been in great relation. Doesn't matter that we're talking about Catholics and Arians. Actually, this is one of the cases that proves that there was no real concern in this situation, and that the problem was much more deeply political in terms of dominance over Rome, over Italy, and who would have had to do that, right? And all the kind of European Mediterranean system that we have described before. There were some other one great preoccupation in the sense of Belisarius had been, of the Constantinopolitan government, was to remove the Pope Silverius, that had been accused, in fact, of having supported the Goths during the siege, and the Pope had been sent to Constantinople, then sent back to Italy, and eventually killed in the exile on the island of Ponza. And this is just the mindset, right? The practice, the ruthlessness of the Byzantine government. This is not just about Justinian. You have to understand, and of course, the Pope could be removed, and that you would have had another one in your favor, such as Pope Vigilius, in fact, that cooperated at this point with Belisarius after Silverius. But the Caesar-papistic mentality of the Byzantines, that fundamentally would always be rejected by the West, that remained the truest. We will see now, even in terms of orthodoxy, compared to Constantinople, was constantly winking at heretics, not just to maintain, in fact, the eastern provinces and all, but literally also to oppress the papacy, because they couldn't concede that there was, as they perfectly knew it was the case, that a spiritual authority was actually superior to the emperor, right? And this thing made them freak out, right? It's the same reason why there would be an investiture struggle in the West later on, but it's something that the Westerners had been cultivating as a, as a sense of good reason, right? And after all, like, for it doesn't matter how prestigious the imperial power is, there always must be a system of checks and balancement for which you cannot just have an autocratic imposer that decides just whatever has to happen just to increase further power for himself. He must be challenged by an opposition, and even more, of course, from a spiritual advice, right? That was never institutionally or universally adverse to the idea of imperial power per se, but that had to voice the admonishment that by quite some time mankind couldn't quite succeed in saving it by itself, right? And that presuming the contrary naturally was like saying good luck to you, but what happens eventually on Earth is going to demonstrate whether it's going to succeed it or not. And just the fact that they wouldn't succeed ipso facto, so that the fact that it wouldn't be already at this point a single ruler over the world, demonstrates that you were not capable of saving yourself and returning to the One as God yourself. So there is always a fault in any person after the fall, and even though we are made in God's image, so we have a spark of divine nature potentially within us, right? Accomplishing that task of just being a perfect ruler and being to the top standard imaginable, ruling literally the entire universe, is not here. So in the very moment in which you realize you're not such a thing, it means you're sinning. And there must be someone to show you, right? And otherwise you will just essentially grow delusional regarding what order should in fact rule over the world. And this is the entire point also why this struggle was occurring. Pope Vigilius had supported Belisarius and the Byzantine reconquest inasmuch as the commander-in-chief of, in fact, the Italian forces had founded on the Flaminia road close to Orte the monastery of Saint Juvenal, right? And Vigilius had offered to this new foundation cross encrusted with gems with the names of the Byzantine victory engraved on it, plus 2 great silver candelabras. Finally, the same Rome was restored with a discreet, in fact, building activity taking place under Belisarius. Right, so this phase was fairly positive because, again, the general took care of Roman matters. Again, it's how important the universal center of the empire was, such prestige by the great Italian triumphs of Belisarius, whose forces were, by the way, carrying on the struggle against the gods successfully, rendered the emperor Justinian suspicious, to the point of, in fact, recalling to the Bosphorus his general, who obeyed because likely he wasn't, at least at this point, able to literally carry out a coup or inverting the situation, because the gods had been tamed, right, rather than crushed, right? And Belisarius' accomplishments probably have in Italy probably have to do also with this, right? The Vandals had been properly crushed in battle, and they were a smaller kingdom, and somehow they were redeployed, resettled, whatever. The Goths had suffered a similar fate, except they were more, and they were located in quite strategic areas all across the Italian peninsula, where in most cases such federati were maintained, right? Also in pretty large and still potentially dangerous numbers, right? You see, with the Vandals, it had happened something similar, because there were already some Vandals settled as, say, peasant soldiers, like a sort of farming militia on the outskirts of the Berber frontier, just to defend the local communities with their simple presence, right? Some military colonies. The Goths had been somehow a bit like in the same situation. They had understood also that for now the imperial forces were stronger than them, and they had basically, just as we've seen, offered even the same Belisarius the opportunity of becoming king of Italy, which was an attempt to essentially to not necessarily to make him pass from their side because they were defeated in part, but rather showing him that they would have been disposed to fight for him in case he would have liked to make essentially Italy an autonomous country once again from Constantinople. And that was a very clever move, because as we've seen, the Ostrogoths, also after Theodoric had been somehow fractured, now the same Belisarius had mistreated the Romano-Italic senatorial aristocracy to the point that he couldn't really pressure more than much, not to be overwhelmed by enemies internally, and his military success was surely deriving from a kind of a political agreement. Belisarius now had the same problems that the Goths had, right? That there was still this more or less intact senatorial aristocracy that ruled the country as a parallel government, and that now was essentially at least under the threat of Belisarius' forces that could even carry out a program of broader reform for example, land distribution, which is what the same Goths would start pursuing to convince, because they liked having estates too, and that's also part of the reason why they really hoped to, in some cases, that was one party to transition, kind of more Roman direction, and another one said, let's not compromise ourselves in that regard, because otherwise we will become just like a Roman aristocracy, and others thought that instead this was the only way to do it. So it was a delicate situation. Naturally, Constantinople wanted, or at least, let's put it in this way, couldn't quite wipe out the local Roman aristocracy, because again, doing such a thing would have brought the same, as we've seen also with the papacy and other Roman families, to side with the Goths, even against imperial arms, right? So it was an incredibly complicated situation still that required a much greater effort, which would have eventually been carried out by the same Constantinople later on, also involving other federati, the same Longobards we were talking about before, that would eventually enter Italy, and it's the same reason why there weren't enough Byzantines, not even a field army, to do anything when these moved into Italy, because there had been the plague had struck hard the empire already. We'll say in some other video, but generally speaking, the system had held, right? Most of these, again, Western territories had been controlled. The Byzantines were mostly just interested about the coasts, and probably they thought they could handle the Federati anyway, but this is another topic, right? So this is the reason why, as we've seen, Belisarius is recalled to Constantinople, to the Bosphorus, and by the way, bringing together with himself as a hostage Viticus, right? Theoderic's successor, because at that point the Ostrogothic king had capitulated as well, and he preferred that and being sent as a prisoner to Constantinople that carry on the struggle. This would lead to the rise of other leaders, because the Ostrogoths had problems also as far as that. Again, they were very politically divided within themselves. Some, legitimately speaking, freaked out because they thought, I mean, carrying out a struggle against the Byzantines was now to be done from a very difficult position. But Totila managed really to gather enough forces morally. Also thanks again to the support of the Italians, of the colonists that were promised with freedom once the war would have been over and the Ostrogoths would have won, right? So that was a great factor, even in the degree of the destructions, because it was literally becoming also social strife of the Italian peasantry against not much anymore the Romano-Italic aristocracy, but now properly Byzantine occupants that wanted to maintain, instead as much as they could, the latifundiate, at least in their hands, right? So with also an oppressive fiscalism, as we just said, and so on. In fact, in parallel to the military officials, Constantinople was sending civilian ones, such as the Logothet Alexander, that was a man of trust of the imperial court, so he was well known by Justinian, and he was his policy's man, right? In this picture, that was immediately opposed by the Romans, as it was essentially nicknamed as the Shearer or something like that, because he would have shorn, for personal interest, let's put it in this way, the gold coins of the imperial mint of Rome. This was a huge deal, because naturally these officials were very corrupted, as generally speaking, any government at the time really was. But again, additionally to this was just, again, a foreigner, right? That was just coming there to cash for Constantinople, right? This is the situation in which Italy becomes. It's essentially a peripheral province that has this huge prestige and of Rome and the resources connected to it, but eventually it is not going to be central to the broader balance of the empire strategically or whatever. So here Constantinople draws an enormous amount of resources from the city. Consider that we'll see it also in other videos about, let's say, Byzantine Italy, so this short time between the Reconquest and the Lombard invasion, in which that is, again, as you understood already from here, is that we don't know everything about it, but there are some quite interesting indicators. First of all, consider that the cities here were some of the largest of the empire. I mean, literally, Rome was the second largest after Constantinople, just by some acre in extension surfacially. Then cities like Verona, like Milan, like some in the north were quite large by imperial standards. Just Antioch or Aphrodisia or Alexandria were substantially big, right? Just like after Constantinople. And these cities, we've seen it even in the case of some recently. I made that video about medieval Parma, where for a while the Byzantine imperial treasury of Italy was located, right? Were squeezed, right, properly with a tax, right, fixated in gold, right? This is something that had to be paid from all the biggest cities of the empire. That's the same reason why Justinian had to compromise with monophysitism in the east, because some of the most important cities like Jerusalem, again Alexandria and Antioch, etc., were normally asked this enormous amount of precious metals that was gradually alienating also the sympathy towards Constantinople, that, however, in the meanwhile was building, of course, herself, right, as the incredibly solid center of a millenary empire, also thanks to these resources. And Alexander in Rome essentially cut all the salaries granted to the Roman heirs of the domestici, the silenziari, the scholares, so all officials that had been part of the imperial hierarchy in late antiquity and administration, all the people, again, that had been administrating Italy also under Ostrogothic times, according to this, again, class of honors that's typical, again, of the period. Which means that basically the Roman aristocracy was also despoiled of significant revenue. And together with that, Alexander also cancelled the annual distributions of 3,000 modi of wheat destined to the poor in the area of St. Peter, which was a way essentially to make the Roman, say, Rome shrink in a way, right? Properly subtracting resources to this city was, again, so important. So still potentially, and also from the papacy, from the very veins of the city, of the local aristocracy, etc., still, and especially at this point, under such heavy fiscalism, opposed to the to the Byzantines, say, in quite ambiguous relations with the Gauls, that, from, as we'll see now, from the other side, were sending to Rome from the north, where Totila had already risen against, would rise at least in these years, against the Byzantine rule. Lots of signals, of promises, of proofs of good disposition to continue actually the alliance of the Romans and the Ostrogoths that had, at the end of the day, been successfully functioning up to the Byzantine invasion. All right, so a moment again of prosperity, which again in Ostrogothic Italy, Rome, the papacy had enjoyed a very high reputation, consideration. They were, as we've seen, properly involved in the same rule of the country. So it had been by this point where the Romans realized what it meant to have the Byzantines at home, how harsh, right, how more preferable the previous situation was to this point. Naturally, also the Byzantines had carried out an act of force, right? The Roman senators were anxious, let's say, to again re-enter the empire, but not quite to be squeezed at all, like in this way. And so what occurred was just by a degree unpredictable, but essentially what just they hoped was to be within the Roman Empire, but in a decentralized position, right? That was always the case, and also for the papacy later on, with the empire always being on their own, with their possessions, with their Romanity, culturally, socially, in many ways. So, to make the long story short, Justinian directly and through the functionaries demonstrated to consider also the urbs as a land of conquest, right? This caused a great discontent, especially among the Romans, by the way, that initially had at least welcomed the Byzantines as liberators, right? Remember that not all Italy was the same, right? There were areas that were just historically more predisposed to the Byzantine Mediterranean rule. and even though Rome was still significantly within that kind of order of things, still had already a kind of central, kind of Italian continental interest, right, of some sort, especially as far as the possessions around Rome were concerned, but also considering that the papacy had traditionally maintained great amounts of land in southern Italy, in Sicily, that now were also being treated differently, right, and perhaps also in this sense had been happier than the same Rome, than the same papacy, to now being at least more autonomous under Byzantine rule than just under the latifundia of this aristocracy or things like that. So again, the picture is extremely variegated. So Baduila and Totila, the same name, from 441 was king of the Goths, who had rearmed across the peninsula, mostly in northern Italy, carrying out consistent progress, militarily speaking, and de facto reoccupied successfully the lost lands, also in southern Italy, as early as 544. This was the consequence of Belisarius' removal. The fact that he had also not been left properly to finish the job, right? Again, as we were saying before, he could have in part just taken out the Goths, but he may have essentially wanted to use them in order just to defend Italy at that point, because as we've seen across the Alps, there were other groups who were looking at the peninsula and at what the Byzantines were doing concretely. And this lack of unity of command had somehow paralyzed the Byzantine forces that had not been adequately reorganized across the reconquered peninsula. And the Goths managed to, with the support of the Italian population, to reconquer these territories. This could be measured surely in a very precise way when by Constantinople, when the Byzantine tax collectors began to send back overseas ever less contributions, right, of the ones that had been settled at least to by imperial policy to be drawn from the peninsula, right. Again, the Italians start getting tired already of the Constantinopolitans, also because the subjects quickly realized that the emperor, that he is really a very skilled tax collector, right, politically speaking, is instead much less prone to safeguard the same peninsula from the Goths, right? Remember this, that were still some Romans that legitimately wanted the Goths out because they thought, again, they could keep administering their own country without too much of an interference from both sides, and they immediately realized that the fact that the Byzantines had managed to reconquer the peninsula had brought to a savage looting to some degree, mildly enough not to cause like an open rebellion against the same imperial government, but that in this sense the imperial authority was not interested even properly in providing enough troops at that point against the same god coming back, which was very short-sighted from the Byzantine side. Indeed, the removal of Belisarius is one of the single most critical, episodes in Justinian's reign. Right, the idea is, why, right? Even though he may have felt threatened or whatever, still the Italian campaign was shipwrecked, and basically this opened to a continuous amount of warfare that lasted for another decade, where armies made back and forth across the peninsula multiple times with great destructions, damage, the population. It was really terrifying. And there is naturally a great opportunity for the Goths that is rendered even more, let's say, visible by this Byzantine attitude of contempt, specifically against the Roman Church, let's say, traditional spiritual autonomy and prestige. Why? Because in those same years, in Constantinople, the Edict of the Three Chapters, we discussed it in other videos, was emanated, right? So what were these three chapters? Well, it's a bit of a complex story, but to make the long story short, these were three works that had been condemned by Justinian, that had accused, in fact, the authors of these two have been Nestorian, right? It had been accused of Nestorianism, that was a heresy that had been already condemned, and that fundamentally overstressed the separation of the two natures of Christ, right? This was, in theory, in line with the idea, of course, that in Christ there is that, as it had been established in Chalcedon and reaffirming in the Nicene Creed, of course, that there are in Christ there is that Christ is the person of the Son, and within him there are two distinct natures. However, such the condemnation of an excessive ideology of the same concept sounded like something against, in theory, the same concept of the two natures that was the one rejected by the monophysitists, that is to say, the most powerful heresy, again existing in the Levant, also in Egypt, etc., that was naturally compromising the political control of Constantinople. These provinces, they were quite rich. As the Monophysites believed, as the name Monophysitists, as the name says, believed instead that Christ had only one nature, and this was essentially only the divine one, so not the human one at the same time, right? Now, this action, you can see that this produced a schism, by the way, because many provinces, including the northern Italian ones, that would, in fact, let's say, remain under the Gothic control at the point, and however eventually reconquered, they also would be the ones more eager to open the gates to the Longobards and all these things, because there were still gods within them, had rejected, just even, these were normal Roman Catholics, right? They had nothing to do with the Ostrogoths in terms of an association with Arianism. In fact, the Goths as Arians didn't even care about this theological thing. I mean, they had other problems to think about in first place, but also doctrinally speaking, yes, they were Arians, but they didn't. It was just a way to say we are kind of like Christians, so we are like the Romans, but not quite like the Romans, right? And eventually, you know that even under the Longobards, there were Arians themselves. There was no real religious tension of any sort, no persecution, whatever. And actually, the Tricapitoline Schism will be a matter bringing the Church of Rome and this other, and the Goths and the Longobards later, closer against Constantinople, because it was this say in Rome, this was accepted initially, as long as naturally the Byzantines retained an important control on the city, and so they could simply enforce a papal direction that couldn't be quite changed in that condition, but on the longer run would erode further the Roman Church's sympathy towards Constantinople. Pope Vigilius was also forced to accept this in a way or another, and in the West, this Tricapitoline schism, that at some point was not even the worst thing the Byzantines did in the future, in inside, let's say from a doctrinal point of view, but they still, were playing quite in quite a slippery way against the papacy at any good condition, so at any good chance. And this brought instinctively, even just like the Romans, like the Roman subjects in Italy that were good Catholics. I mean, by this point, the peninsula was already fully Christianized, to hate the Byzantines even more, right? And this is what this broader Catholic disappointment brings Totila, king of the gods, to ask the same Roman senators in this quite turbulent situation where the gods they had reconquered most of Italy, to be recognized once again in the same way the senators had done with Theodoric the Great, and writing concerning this topic a letter with which he properly reawakened the Roman sense of pride, right? Given that the Gothic king essentially praised himself with lots of compliments the same orbs with her palaces and her streets, right, and roads, and stressing her greatness. So this was a message from Totila now to recreate the Ostrogothic kingdom with a strong Roman legitimization supporting him, right? And on this occasion, Totila fixed along the Via Sacra, that is the Holy Road, some manifestos countersigned by himself, right? So with pretty eloquent, like, this is my word in front of the world on the Holy Road to the capital of the Universal Empire. From the north, right? This is also the direction from which kind of, so conceptually, the rulers of the north, of, the Hyperborean region, right? According to the mythology, the legions of the same Rome, or the same Italics originally, now the gods, in which he commits himself, he promises not to essentially bring any violence to the Romans, to whom must be known the love of Baduila's predecessors, the Gothic rulers, for the orbs and for Italy. This is a beautiful propaganda, because it literally stressed the bond existing, right, between, at that point, the Romans and the Germans against these other people. We're not the Romans anymore, because the Romans are the ones of Rome, right? Not the ones of Constantinople. Behind this, naturally, there is much more. At some point, we will make a bit more of a philological and kind of ideological inquiry of such policy, like of the late Gothic period of in Italy. In any case, this propaganda has success because in Rome, because of all what happened that we've seen today, and ever since, there is a philogothic public opinion, right? The same one that induced Belisarius to suspect and first kind of, deport Pope Silverius back in the day. And at this point keeping Vigilius also under, while Constantinople was enforcing the 3 chapters, the condemnation of the 3 chapters. Furthermore, the Arian cult in Rome is not entirely outlawed. This is another very important indicator. You see, there were Arians in Rome. The gods were Arians, but there were other people coming from other places in Europe that were Arian Christians. But they went to Rome anyway because they believed, right, in the pilgrimage value, in the fact that Rome was the place of martyrdom of St. Peter's, of St. Paul, the sacredness of the place, and so on. And mostly they were gods, of course, but coming to Rome. And the church of Sant'Agata, of the gods, that still exists, it's not really the older one, but that was founded by Ricimer in the 5th century, is open, remains open. This is very interesting because at this point Rome is ruled by like a Catholic elite, and the Byzantines have come, etc. But the Church of the Gods in Rome is not closed. The Arians can profess their faith, and interestingly enough, the church still exists, as I was saying before. Actually, it's not the original one from the 5th century, but this lasted for a millennium because basically it was destroyed completely in the 16th century, as it was just a ruin by that point. And there is another church today, from the modern age, that is also very, on the same place. That is the same Sant'Agata of the Gods, in fact, and you can visit in Rome, bearing, witness of this legacy. And the meaning of this is that the reapproaching of the 2 nationalities in the name of Rome is possible. The Romans and the Germans here were siding against the Byzantines. And we will see the second siege of Rome, well, in fact, in 544, Totila is newly in march at the head of his soldiers towards the Eternal City, held by the Byzantines. I think this perspective is crucial. I mean, understanding how much Latin-Germanic identity is at the very root of the kind of the Western civilization intended as properly the medieval, the modern, and the contemporary one, right? This is not to say that the Byzantines were not Westerner in a broader sense, but the concept that eventually the Holy Roman Empire, this bond existing, the centrality of Rome and of her spiritual guidance for the Roman Empire, right? The empire was recreated as Roman because there was no other way but bearing the name of the city that had representated in Augustan times the Golden Age, and so rendered the possibility of salvation real once again. And that's also where Christianity had grafted herself, Romanly speaking, right? And so how crucial, even in this moment of kind of the possibility of the continuity of the existence of a Romano-Germanic reality of the type, let's say, of the late antique type, was ideologically consistent with this, right? And even though, again, this war would bring to the end of late antiquity in the peninsula, still the idea that say the imperium had essentially stemmed from the capacity of rejecting even those who claimed to be the true rulers, but that couldn't hold the control de facto of the world, right? And here Rome is the parallel of it is quite relevant, because naturally Rome, as we remember at the beginning, would be maintained by the papacy. The Longobards, for example, would never compromise as Romans, right? At best, they became protectors of the Romans after they seized Ravenna in the 8th century. They wanted to take over Rome. There was a Philo-Longobard party in Rome before the Carolingian invasion of Italy. But in general, the possibility of a coexistence of peoples under a Roman Catholic Empire would be effectively resumed, not just by the Carolingians as such, but through the realization, as it was in Longobard time, that in fact the universality of the empire could live within the spiritual communion of Rome. That is to say, in that case, it was, from a Longobar perspective, no empire that was at least factually ruling over them, and so that they considered themselves still bearing their own imperium, as others did. But they recognized the sanctity of Romanity in the first place, in the measure in which they related to the Capitoline Church, right? And so it would be the Carolingians who took the next step, and from Ottonian times you properly have a fully ethnic Roman recognition of the ethnic identity of the empire from the side of the Saint Germans that remained for good right until Napoleon, and that in a sense after that just the Roman Church was to maintain, because after all other like empires didn't kind of care very much after that, even until 1918, to stress. But first of all, some were Orthodox, but even the fact that the Holy Roman Empire from Austria was not revived after Restoration was prevented was just yet another let's say indicator of the aforementioned destruction, like the gradual collapse of the universal empire in the Fourth Age, the one in which fundamentally mankind falls and cannot even achieve again a minimal cohesion, right, politically speaking, to the point of even like most people do today, like they even think that having a universal empire is allegedly something negative and traditional, which is the single most anti-traditional concept that you can properly make, because first of all it gets completely rid of all the transfigurational ecumenic issue, and it properly speaks of the complete lack of any moral worth in the current world. And here, studying history is the painful realization that after the fulfillment of the Roman prophecy in between the Bronze and the Iron Age, that did speak of a temporary return of the Golden One, and that is, surprise, surprise, the Augustan reign in which also Christ was born. There's been just a steady decline, right? And that in theory we can, of course, fix things, which seems unlikely to be recovered, but giving up is exactly the same reason why all this happened in the first place. Well, for today, however, I stop it here. We will continue our series about medieval, say ancient, medieval, modern, contemporary Rome. Again, this series I created last year to focus specifically just properly on the history of the city as such. However, for today, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I always thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.